She flipped the switch. Click. Darkness. 10 minutes later, light. Margaret couldn't explain it. Electricians couldn't explain it. The light in her basement wouldn't stay off. September 28th, 1994. Cedar Falls, Iowa. A single mother. A normal house. An impossible problem. She counted every time. 127 times in 3 weeks, the light turned itself back on. She changed the switch. It continued. She locked the door. It opened. She unplugged everything. The light stayed on. Then she found them. Photographs she'd never seen. On her dryer, arranged in a line. Pictures of a man in a basement workshop. A workshop that didn't exist anymore. But the man died in her house. She called police. Officer Kowalski went downstairs. He found something behind the wall, something that had been hidden for 20 years. Something that explained why the light kept turning on, but it didn't explain why it stopped. The moment Margaret said his name. Drop a comment if you'd investigate. Subscribe if you'd run. This is A Woman Turns Off the Basement Light in 1994. It turns back on by itself. Margaret Holloway moved into the house on Sycamore Street in June of 1993, a full 16 months before the light began its impossible behavior. The home was a foreclosure, 73 years old, structurally sound, with hardwood floors that creaked in all the predictable places, and a basement that stayed mercifully cool even during Iowa's humid summers. The real estate agent mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the previous owner had died in the home. Natural causes, old age, nothing unusual. Margaret didn't care. She was a registered nurse at Sunnyside Care Facility, accustomed to death in its mundane forms, the slow fade, the expected goodbye, the peaceful passing. She'd seen enough of the clinical reality of mortality to have little patience for superstition. The house was affordable. The neighborhood was safe. The school district was good for Emily. That was enough. The basement became her laundry room and storage space, concrete floors, exposed joists, a single bulb hanging from a porcelain fixture near the washer and dryer. The light switch was at the top of the stairs, a standard toggle, installed probably in the 1960s when the house was updated. She'd go down twice a week to do laundry, sometimes more. The light worked perfectly. Click on, click off. Unremarkable. Emily adjusted quickly to the new home. She was 7 years old, bright and talkative, still young enough to believe her mother could fix anything. Margaret's ex-husband, Emily's father, lived 3 states away and sent checks irregularly. They managed. Margaret worked the overnight shift Thursday through Monday, slept during the day while Emily was at school, and maintained the careful routine that single parenthood demanded. Neighbors described them as quiet, polite, self-sufficient. The first incident happened on September 28th, 1994, a Wednesday evening. Margaret had just returned from a rare day shift, covering for a colleague, and was sorting mail in the kitchen when she noticed the glow beneath the basement door. She frowned. She distinctly remembered turning the light off that morning after moving a load of laundry to the dryer. She walked to the door, opened it, and confirmed. The basement was illuminated. The single bulb cast its yellowish light across the concrete floor. She descended the stairs and pulled the chain. Click. Darkness. She stood there for a moment, listening. The furnace hummed distantly. The water heater ticked as it heated. Nothing else. She went back upstairs, returned to her mail, and thought nothing more of it. 10 minutes later, Emily called from the living room. "Mom, did you go back downstairs?" Margaret looked up. Light was seeping under the basement door again. This time, Margaret felt the first whisper of unease. She walked to the door more slowly, opened it, and stared down into the illuminated space. The bulb was on. She descended, pulled the chain again. Click. And this time she stood at the bottom of the stairs in the darkness, counting to 30. Nothing happened. She climbed back up, closed the door, and sat at the kitchen table. 5 minutes passed. Then the light returned. Margaret called an electrician the next morning. A man named Harold Voss arrived that afternoon, a graying contractor who'd been wiring homes in Cedar Falls for 30 years. He examined the switch, the wiring. The fixture itself, he flipped the switch 24 times. He tested for short circuits, checked the breaker box, inspected the bulb. Everything functioned normally. He stood at the top of the stairs and told Margaret he couldn't find anything wrong, but if it made her feel better, he could replace the switch entirely. She agreed. He installed a new one. The problem persisted. By the second week of October, Margaret had stopped using the basement except when absolutely necessary. The light would turn itself on 3, sometimes 4 times per evening. She developed a routine. Turn it off, wait, turn it off again, wait, turn it off a 3rd time. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't. She began to feel as though she were engaged in a conversation with the house itself, a slow, wordless negotiation she didn't understand. And then she started noticing the other things. The kitchen radio turned on by itself on October 11th. Margaret was upstairs putting Emily to bed when she heard the static hiss from downstairs, a low, crackling sound that made her freeze mid-sentence in the bedtime story. She kissed Emily's forehead, told her to stay in bed, and descended the stairs, slowly. The radio on the counter was on, tuned between stations, filling the kitchen with white noise. She turned it off. She hadn't used the radio in weeks. The next morning, she found the basement light on again. This time, she didn't bother turning it off immediately. Instead, she stood at the top of the stairs and spoke aloud, feeling foolish, even as she did it. If someone is down there, you need to leave. Silence. She descended, pulled the chain, and returned upstairs. The light stayed off for 6 hours. A record. Margaret began keeping a journal, documenting each incident with the detached precision of someone trained in medical charting. October 11th, radio, 8:47 p.m. Light, following morning. October 12th, light, 3:15 p.m., again at 9:22 p.m. October 13th, no incidents. October 14th, light, 11:05 a.m. Basement door found open at 2:30 p.m. Certain I closed it. She didn't share the journal with anyone. Who would she tell? What would she say? Emily asked why they weren't going to the basement anymore. Margaret told her the dryer was making a funny noise and she wanted to get it fixed before using it again. Emily accepted this without question. Children, Margaret had learned, accepted almost anything if you said it with enough confidence. But Margaret herself was sleeping poorly now, waking at odd hours, listening to the house settle and creak, unable to distinguish between normal sounds and something else. On October 15th, Margaret called her mother in Des Moines. She kept the conversation light, mentioned the electrical issues in passing, framed it as a minor annoyance. Her mother suggested she have the whole house rewired. Old houses were full of problems, she said. That's just what you dealt with when you bought a fixer-upper. Margaret agreed and changed the subject. After they hung up, Margaret sat in the kitchen and stared at the basement door. She knew it wasn't the wiring. She knew because Harold Voss knew his job and because new switches don't malfunction within days of installation. She knew because late at night, when Emily was asleep and the house was silent, she could hear something moving in the basement. Not footsteps exactly. Nothing so concrete. More like the sound of weight shifting, the faint groan of floorboards that shouldn't groan because the basement floor was concrete. She'd lie in bed and listen, her heart hammering, telling herself it was the furnace, the pipes, the natural expansion and contraction of an old house. But the sounds always seemed to correspond with the light. When the basement was dark, the house was quiet. When the light came on by itself, she'd hear the movement. On October 16th, Margaret did something she'd been avoiding. She went to the Cedar Falls Public Library and asked if there were any records about her house, particularly about the previous owner. The librarian, a kind woman in her 60s named Ruth Albright, helped her search through property records and old newspaper archives. They found an obituary, Howard Fenwick, age 81. died peacefully in his home on Sycamore Street in January 1993, survived by no immediate family. Services held at Dahl von Hove Schoof Funeral Home. Margaret copied the obituary and brought it home. That night, the basement light turned on 7 times. She stopped counting after that. The next day, she called the funeral home. She asked to speak with someone who might remember Howard Fenwick's services. After being transferred twice, she reached Arnold Scoof, one of the funeral directors. He remembered the case. Quiet affair, few attendees. The deceased had been something of a recluse in his final years. Margaret asked if Mr. Fenwick had any particular attachment to the house. Arnold paused before answering, "Well, he lived there for 40-some years. Built that basement workshop himself back in the 70s. Spent most of his time down there, from what I understand. Why do you ask?" Margaret thanked him and hung up without answering. That evening, she stood at the top of the basement stairs and said aloud, "Mr. Fenwick, if that's you, I need you to stop." The light turned on 3 minutes later. Margaret stopped trying to rationalize it after October 17th. That was the night she found the photographs. She'd been putting away groceries when she noticed the basement door was open again, not just unlocked, but standing open a full 6 inches, light spilling into the kitchen. She set down the milk and approached slowly. She hadn't opened that door in hours. Emily was at a friend's house for a sleepover. Margaret was alone. She pushed the door open fully and descended the stairs, her hand trailing along the rough wood of the railing. The basement looked exactly as it always did. Washer, dryer, storage boxes stacked against the far wall, her Christmas decorations in labeled containers. But on top of the dryer, arranged in a careful line, were 4 photographs. Margaret picked them up with shaking hands. They were old, faded color prints from the 1970s or early 80s. Each showed the basement in an earlier incarnation, a workshop with a table saw, pegboard walls hung with tools, cabinets Margaret had never seen. And in 3 of the 4 photographs, a man, Howard Fenwick, she assumed, stood beside his workbench, smiling slightly, proud of his domain. Margaret's breath came shallow and fast. She hadn't put these photographs here. They hadn't been here this morning. She'd been in the basement 2 days ago to grab detergent, and there'd been nothing on the dryer. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the space. Everything else appeared untouched. She climbed the stairs quickly, photographs clutched in her hand, and locked the basement door from the outside. Then she called her neighbor, Tom Anderson, and asked if he could come over for a few minutes. Tom arrived within 5 minutes, concerned by the tone of her voice. Margaret showed him the photographs and explained, as calmly as she could manage, that she'd found them in her basement but didn't know where they'd come from. Tom examined them, frowning. "These look like they're from the previous owner's time," he said. "Maybe they were tucked in a box somewhere and fell out." Margaret wanted to believe that. But the photographs had been arranged, deliberately placed, and the boxes on her shelves hadn't been disturbed in months. Tom offered to search the basement with her. They went down together, Tom leading with a flashlight, despite the overhead light being on. They opened boxes, moved containers, checked behind the furnace. They found nothing that explained the photograph's sudden appearance. Tom suggested that maybe the house had a ventilation issue that was creating air currents, moving light objects around. Margaret didn't argue. She thanked him, and after he left, she sat at her kitchen table and stared at the photographs until her vision blurred. That night, she moved Emily's mattress into her bedroom permanently. She told her daughter it was because she'd been lonely sleeping by herself. Emily, delighted by the change, accepted the explanation without suspicion. Margaret, however, barely slept. She lay in the darkness listening to the house, waiting for the telltale glow under her bedroom door that would indicate the basement light had turned on again. It did, at 2:17 a.m. She knew because she was watching the clock. The following morning, Margaret called in sick to work, her first sick day in 11 months. She spent the day researching the house's history more thoroughly. She visited the county assessor's office and pulled building permits. She learned that Howard Fenwick had indeed extensively remodeled the basement in 1974, adding the workshop, installing new electrical, building custom storage. The permits described it as his retirement project. He'd been 62 years old. She returned home to find the basement light on. This time, when she went downstairs to turn it off, she found something new. A single screwdriver lying in the middle of the concrete floor. It was old, the handle worn smooth with use, the shaft showing rust. It hadn't been there that morning. Margaret was certain. She picked it up slowly, her skin prickling with goosebumps despite the basement's warmth. She carried it upstairs, placed it in a kitchen drawer, and locked the basement door again. At 4 p.m., she heard the sound of the door unlocking from the inside. She was sitting in the living room, reading to Emily, when she heard the distinctive click of the deadbolt sliding free. She stood, walked to the kitchen, and stared. The basement door stood open. The light was on. The screwdriver was gone from the drawer. Margaret sent Emily to play in her room, descended the stairs, and found the screwdriver back where she discovered it, in the center of the floor. This time, she didn't pick it up. She climbed the stairs, closed the door, and called the police. Officer David Kowalski arrived at 5:43 p.m. on October 19th, 1994. He was 36 years old, a 12-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department, and had responded to countless domestic disturbances, welfare checks, and noise complaints. He'd never responded to a call quite like Margaret Holloway's. She met him at the door, composed but clearly exhausted, and explained the situation with the careful diction of someone who knew how implausible her story sounded. Kowalski listened without interrupting. He'd learned that the first rule of responding to unusual calls was to take the resident seriously. Even when the situation seemed irrational, the fear was always real. When Margaret finished, he asked if he could see the basement. She led him to the kitchen and gestured to the door. "The light's on again," she said. "And there's a screwdriver on the floor that I didn't put there. I locked this door from the outside. It shouldn't be open." Kowalski noticed the door was indeed standing ajar. He pushed it open fully, hand resting on his service weapon out of habit, and peered down the stairs. Standard basement. Concrete, washer, dryer, storage. The light was on. He descended slowly, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. At the bottom, he saw the screwdriver exactly where Margaret had described it. He picked it up, examined it, then walked the perimeter of the basement, checking the windows, all locked from the inside, and looking for any sign of entry or disturbance. He found nothing. The basement was secure. No broken windows, no disturbed dirt around the foundation windows, no footprints in the dust of the far corners. He climbed back up and asked Margaret when she'd last been down there. 2 hours ago, she said. I turned off the light, locked the door, put the screwdriver in that drawer. She pointed. When I heard the door unlock, I came in and found it like this. Kowalski asked if anyone else had a key to the house. No, Margaret said. Just her and Emily had been in her room the entire time. He asked if there was anyone who might want to frighten her or play a prank. Margaret shook her head. She got along fine with her neighbors, had no conflicts at work, no angry ex-boyfriend or disgruntled acquaintance. I know how this sounds, she said quietly, but I'm not making it up. Something is happening in this house. Kowalski made notes. He asked if she'd consider having someone stay with her for a few nights. Family, perhaps, or a friend. Margaret said her mother could come up from Des Moines. He suggested she document everything, keep the basement door locked, and call if anything escalated. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. Mrs. Holloway, he said, have you considered that there might be someone accessing your home when you're not here? Maybe through an entrance you haven't found? Margaret had considered it. That possibility frightened her less than the alternative. After Kowalski left, Margaret called her mother. Barbara Holloway arrived the next morning, a brisk, practical woman in her early 60s who'd raised 3 children and had little patience for nonsense. She listened to Margaret's account, toured the house, and pronounced the whole thing a series of unfortunate coincidences blown out of proportion by stress and exhaustion. Margaret didn't argue. She was too tired to argue. That night, Barbara slept in Emily's room while Emily bunked with Margaret. At 1:33 a.m., Barbara woke to the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor below her. She lay still, listening. The sound continued for perhaps 30 seconds. A slow, scraping noise, deliberate and rhythmic. Then it stopped. Barbara rose, pulled on her robe, and went downstairs. The basement light was on, visible under the door. She opened it and descended the stairs, prepared to confront an intruder. The basement was empty, but the washer had been moved, pulled several inches away from the wall, as though someone had been trying to access the space behind it. Barbara stared at it, her practical certainty crumbling. The washer was heavy, easily 200 pounds. It would take considerable effort to move. She climbed the stairs, closed the door, and returned to bed. She didn't mention what she'd seen to Margaret until the following afternoon. When she finally told her daughter, Margaret didn't seem surprised. "It wants us to find something," Margaret said. "Behind the washer, that's what I think." Barbara suggested they move the washer in daylight and look. Margaret agreed, but when they went downstairs at 2 p.m., they found the washer had been moved back into place, pushed flush against the wall, as though it had never been disturbed. That evening, Barbara packed her bag and returned to Des Moines. She hugged Margaret tightly before leaving and said, "I don't know what's happening here, but I don't think you should stay." Margaret nodded but didn't commit to leaving. Where would she go? This was her home. She'd sunk every dollar she had into it, and despite everything, despite the fear and the sleepless nights and the impossible occurrences, some part of her believed that understanding what was happening was the key to stopping it. On October 22nd, 1994, Margaret made a decision. She would move the washer herself and see what, if anything, was behind it. She waited until Emily was at school, dressed in old clothes, and descended the basement stairs with a crowbar, a flashlight, and a determination born of exhaustion and desperation. The washer was exactly where it always was, flush against the wall. She wedged the crowbar behind it and pulled. The machine resisted, then scraped forward 6 inches, then another 6 inches, then a foot. Behind the washer, the wall was unremarkable. Concrete blocks, slightly darker where the machine had protected them from dust and light. Margaret ran her hands along the surface, feeling for... what? She didn't know. A crack, a seam, something irregular. Her fingers found it near the floor. A gap in the mortar, barely visible. She wedged the flashlight into the space and peered closer. The gap continued along the base of several blocks, as though they'd been removed and replaced inexpertly. Margaret worked the crowbar into the seam. The mortar crumbled easily, too easily, as though it had been disturbed before. She pried at the blocks. One shifted, then another. Within 20 minutes, she'd removed 3 concrete blocks, creating an opening about 2 feet wide. Behind it was darkness and the smell of old, damp earth. She shone the flashlight into the space. What she saw made her breath catch. A crawl space, an area perhaps 4 feet high and 8 feet deep, extending back under the house foundation. And scattered throughout it, tools. Dozens of tools. Hammers, wrenches, saws, chisels, all arranged with obsessive precision on makeshift wooden shelves. But more than that, notebooks. Stacks of them, bound in leather and canvas, their pages filled with handwriting so small and cramped it was difficult to read in the flashlight's beam. Margaret squeezed through the opening, crawling on her hands and knees into the hidden space. The air was stale, heavy with decades of stillness. She picked up the nearest notebook and opened it. The handwriting was meticulous. Dates, times, measurements, observations. Howard Fenwick's journal, or rather, journals. There were at least 30 of them. Margaret flipped through pages at random, trying to make sense of the entries. Most were mundane. Repaired cabinet hinge, 3/4 screws, completed 2:15 p.m. Planned door to address sticking, removed 1/8 from bottom edge. But as she dug deeper into the stack, the entries changed. They became longer, more reflective, sometimes disturbing. October 1992. Heard Jean's voice again last night. I know she's gone. I know it. But I heard her calling from upstairs. I went up. Nothing. House is empty. Always empty now. January 1993. Getting worse. Can't trust my own ears anymore. Can't trust my own eyes. Yesterday I found tools moved in the workshop. Knew I hadn't touched them. This is what happens. This is what they don't tell you about getting old. Your mind betrays you. Your home betrays you. The final entry was dated January 18th, 1993, 3 days before Howard Fenwick's obituary said he'd died. The handwriting was shaky. I understand now. It's not the house. It's not my mind. It's something else. Something that's always been here, waiting. I hear it moving at night. I see lights when I know I turn them off. Jean used to tell me I worked too much, spent too much time in this basement. She was right. I built something down here, not just the workshop, something else, and now I can't leave. Even when I go upstairs, I'm still here. I'll always be here. Margaret sat back on her heels, the journal trembling in her hands. She understood now, or thought she did. Howard Fenwick had spent decades in this basement, pouring his life into it, and when his wife died, it had become his entire world, and when he died, something of him had remained. Not a ghost exactly. Margaret didn't believe in those, but a presence, an imprint, a man who'd loved his workshop so completely that even death hadn't fully separated him from it. She crawled back out, replaced the blocks carefully, and pushed the washer back against the wall. She carried one of the journals upstairs, the final one, with that last, unsettling entry. She sat at her kitchen table and reread it 3 times. Then she went back down to the basement one more time. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and spoke clearly into the empty space. Mr. Fenwick, I found your journals. I understand you don't want to leave, but this is my home now. You need to let go. The light went out. Not gradually, all at once, plunging the basement into complete darkness. Margaret stood very still, her heart hammering. Then she heard it. A sound like a long, slow exhale, though it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The light flickered back on briefly, then went dark again. This time, it stayed dark. Margaret climbed the stairs, closed the door, and for the first time in weeks, felt something like peace. The basement light never turned on by itself again. Margaret documented this in her journal with the same precision she'd used to track the disturbances. October 22nd through October 31st. No incidents. November 1st through November 15th. No incidents. By Thanksgiving, she'd stopped checking. The house felt different. Lighter, somehow, as though a weight had been lifted from its foundation. Margaret never told anyone about the hidden crawl space or the journals she'd found there. She returned the one she'd taken to its place behind the wall, sealing the blocks back with fresh mortar she bought at the hardware store. It wasn't her story to tell. Those journals belonged to Howard Fenwick, and to whatever grief and loneliness had kept him tethered to the place he'd built with his own hands. She understood that. She respected it. Officer Kowalski followed up twice, once in early November, once just before Christmas. Both times, Margaret assured him everything was fine. The electrical issues had resolved themselves, she said. Sometimes old houses were just difficult. He seemed satisfied, though she caught him glancing at the basement door during his second visit, as though he expected it to swing open on its own. Emily never asked why they'd stopped talking about the broken dryer or why they were using the basement again. Children lived in the present, Margaret reminded herself. They adapted. By December, Emily was bringing friends over again, racing through the house, filling it with noise and laughter. The basement became just a basement once more, a place for laundry and storage, mundane and unremarkable, but Margaret never forgot those 3 weeks in October. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Emily slept peacefully in her own room again, Margaret would sometimes stand at the top of the basement stairs and listen. The house still creaked. The furnace still hummed. The water heater still ticked. But beneath those familiar sounds, she never heard footsteps. She never heard weight shifting on concrete floors. And the light. The light always stayed exactly as she left it. She thought often about Howard Fenwick's final journal entry. "I'll always be here," he'd written. And perhaps some part of him was, not as a haunting or a threat, but as a memory woven into the bones of the house itself. Every home carries the marks of those who lived in it, the wear on the stairs, the scratches on the floors, the particular way doors stick or windows rattle. Howard Fenwick had left more than marks. He'd left himself, built into every joint and corner, and Margaret had learned to coexist with that presence, to acknowledge it without fear. Years later, when Emily was grown and Margaret had become the long-term resident of the house on Sycamore Street, she would occasionally take visitors down to the basement, and they'd comment on how nicely finished it was, how solid the foundation, how well-maintained everything appeared. Margaret would smile and agree. She never mentioned the hidden space behind the washer, or the journals it contained, or the man who'd spent his final years speaking to an empty house. But sometimes, when she was alone doing laundry, she'd pause and look around the basement, at the exposed joists, the concrete floor, the single bulb hanging from its fixture, and she'd think, "We're all looking for a place we belong." Some of us are lucky enough to find it in life. Some of us, like Howard Fenwick, find it so completely that not even death can take it away. And that, Margaret decided, wasn't frightening. It was simply sad, a loneliness so profound it outlasted the body that felt it. The light stays off now. But Margaret still says goodnight to the basement sometimes, a quiet acknowledgement of the man who built it, and the presence that, for a few terrifying weeks in 1994, reminded her that every home has a history. And sometimes, not often, but occasionally, when she turns off that light and climbs the stairs, she swears she can feel something like gratitude in the darkness behind her. A sense of being heard, of being understood, of finally being released. The house on Sycamore Street stands quiet now. Its secrets sealed behind concrete blocks and fresh mortar, its history known only to the woman who stayed when others would have fled. And if you ever find yourself in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and happen to pass that modest 2-story home with the well-kept yard and the basement light that always stays exactly as it's left, remember that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be witnessed, respected, and allowed to rest.